So this lecture is the first of our regular AP Bio units where we jump into the big ideas. The very first unit here is uh, evolution by natural selection, and you can access your screen lectures here at the top always for each unit. The big idea we're looking at in this unit is that the process of evolution has driven the diversity and the unity of life. And what that's trying to say is it has both made us different than one another, but also we share certain sameness with one another. So humans and bacteria don't share a lot in common, but we both carry out the same exact reactions of glycolysis to break down simple carbohydrate sugars. Now, the enduring understandings that we're hoping to gain in this chapter are twofold. First, change in the genetic makeup of a population over time is what we call evolution, and organisms are linked by lines of descent from common ancestry. So in other words, we came from common ancestors, and as we change the genetic makeup of our populations, we're evolving. The essential knowledge that we're going to go through here: natural selection is a major mechanism of evolution, but it's not the only one. Natural selection acts on phenotypic variations in populations like skin color, hair color, body speed, blood type, etc. Evolutionary change is driven by random processes that we'll talk about later. It turns out most of the genetic diversity or species diversity there is on Earth is actually due to randomness, not to natural selection. Next, biological evolution is supported by all kinds of evidence from many disciplines, including math, especially with mathematical modeling, and that organisms share many conserved core processes and features that evolved and are widely distributed among organisms today. Things like glycolysis and the electron transport systems and Krebs cycle, simple chemical reactions, hydrolysis. We share these with all kinds of unfamiliar life forms like remote fungi and archaeans and bacteria. So we have common features that indicates common ancestry. And lastly, we use phylogenetic trees and cladograms to represent the evolutionary history of life forms on Earth. So let's get started. The first thing we need to talk about is how natural selection is a major mechanism of evolution. But this first lecture is actually going to just talk about Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin wasn't the first person to propose a theory of evolution. Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck proposed the theory of evolution in 1809, which is coincidentally the year that Darwin was born. Lamarck proposed that we have a desire to change, and that as we go through life, we acquire, we actually pass changes that we put in our bodies, like darkened skin from sun exposure or thickened muscles from working out. We transmit that to our muscles. We transmit that to our reproductive organs so that our children can inherit the benefit of our life experience. We now know that Lamarck was largely incorrect, but the new study of epigenetics has shown that he was actually partially correct. So that theory of evolution that Lamarck proposed was actually proposed the year that Darwin was born. So Charles Darwin was born in 1809 in England. He lived until 1882. He published his book, his controversial and incredible book, in 1859. It turns out that both Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace proposed the same basic theory of natural selection at the Linnean Society of London in 1858. The only reason that Darwin was present at that, actually Darwin wasn't at the meeting. Someone else actually presented for him in his place. He was at home with his family. He was burying his son. Tragically, one of his children had died. The natural selection theory was actually proposed by both Darwin and Wallace at the same time, but Charles had been working on the theory a lot longer, and he had a book already created. So both Wallace and Darwin experienced very similar lives or island and traveling experiences from a biological perspective, and that's what brought them to the same conclusions about island life and species on Earth in general. So Darwin, at the age of 16, was sent to study medicine at the University of Edinburgh. His family was wealthy. His grandfather was physician to the king. His dad was a doctor, but he was not interested in medicine. He left Edinburgh without a degree. He enrolled at Cambridge and received a Bachelor of Arts in 1831. He was appointed at the last minute, actually as a replacement, to the HMS Beagle, which is a British naval vessel that was basically mapping the world. It turned out it was a 5-year mapping expedition where Darwin was both the ship's, he was supposed to be a mate to the ship's captain, Captain Fitzroy, and he was also supposed to be the biologist on the ship so that he could work on collecting specimens to be brought back to England. The ship left in 1831 and it returned in 1837. It looks like a 6-year stint, but he left actually right at the end of 1831, right before the new year of 1832. So this is, let's see, let me erase the screen here and scroll a little bit. Charles, let's scroll up. Charles, whoa, let's go back up there. This is his worldwide voyage here on the screen. What you see here is he left England here, and they sailed south, and they actually mapped the entire, or a lot of the coast of South America. They visited the Falkland Islands. But his pivotal, he did see things in South America. He discovered fossils of South American life forms that looked like transitional forms between species that were found there today. But the pivotal experience for him was the Galapagos Islands off the west coast of South America, almost due south of good old St. Louis, Missouri. There he saw species of iguana, by the way, which are also found in Central America and South America. He found tortoises, which are present on the mainland. He found snakes. He found finches, which are present on the mainland. And he thought it was quite odd that all these crazy and bizarre species were on the Galapagos and not on the mainland. From there, they continued to sail west. He got to visit Australia, the southern Indian Ocean, and crossed the Horn of Africa, and actually were going to do some more mapping along South America, but the crew insisted after 5 years at sea it was enough. At that point, they turned north, and they made their way back to England. So he was the companion to Captain Robert Fitzroy on the trip. It turned out they didn't get along so well, but that didn't stop him from collecting specimens and doing readings. So he had enormous amounts of time where he spent collecting and classifying and sorting through things that he got from rainforests, pampas, deserts, and mountain areas. He noted that South American temperate regions had flora and fauna dissimilar to Europe, but more similar to the Brazilian tropics. And he thought it was odd that the flora and fauna was distributed that way. Of course, remember, he's not thinking that those species are related. He's probably still got the idea in his head that God put everything there in a few days of creation. He found South American fossils that obviously were more related to modern South American species to anything he knew from Europe. And the most striking thing was he saw the species in the Galapagos Islands, which were endemic and found nowhere else in the world, but they were very similar to South American forms that were due east on the continent of South America. So in particular, the 13 species of finches, which he didn't even know were finches at the time, he found there resembled South American finch species, but each differed in the shape of their beak, adaptations for feeding on different food supplies, behaviors, etc., etc. So Darwin had quite an experience traveling around the world with Fitzroy. This is a map of the Galapagos Islands here. The island chain is volcanic, and some of the smaller islands are receding into the sea. All of the islands you see sticking out are actually the tops of volcanoes. Now, it turns out that while sailing, Darwin read a really important geology book called Principles of Geology, written by Charles Lyell. The book explained that the Earth was very old, and animals and plants have appeared and disappeared over time, and that as he contemplated the geology of the book, it occurred to him that that would have given species enough time to change from one another had the species evolved on their own and not been created in a couple of days of creation. In 1838, Darwin had read Thomas Malthus's essay. This was after he returned. Essay on the Principle of Population, published actually in 1798. This is Malthus down here. This is Lyell here. Here's Wallace here, actually. And here's good old Charles himself right there, later in life. But Malthus actually wrote an essay that had correctly stated that populations grow geometrically, meaning like exponentially, and they easily outgrow their food supplies, which leads to starvation and migration in the end, and population reduction. So that actually gave him the concept, and it coined the phrase struggle for existence in a lot of Darwin supporters. Malthus's book planted the idea that species reproduce too many offspring. This is critical to Darwin's theory. Now Darwin actually developed the theory by the mid-1840s. So less than 10 years after he returned on his Beagle voyage, he had developed basically the theory. But Darwin's health was never good. He spent days and weeks in bed or house-ridden. He was not able to travel after he returned from the voyage. Maybe he had PTSD. Maybe he picked up parasites in some of the foods that he ate. But either way, his health was not good, and he suffered a lot. And it's felt that he just did not have the courage to actually put a book out or publish a book that was going to be extremely controversial and potentially ruin his family's name. But in 1858, he received Wallace's manuscript, which basically stated the same theory that he had developed. And due to the urging of his friends, Darwin and Wallace presented at the Linnean Society in 1858. It was in the summer. It was in July of 1858. But remember, Darwin himself wasn't actually at the meeting. Someone else presented in his place. The following year, Darwin went ahead and published his book, The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. We don't hear much about Wallace after that. He could have been absolutely famous, but unfortunately this gentleman here came up with the theory of natural selection and developed it before Wallace had too much time to think about it. Even though they both presented at the same time, Darwin actually developed the theory much earlier. Darwin was very painstaking and careful about detail and logic in his book. His book is really hard to read as a result. He actually had a mountain of supporting evidence in the book. But the one thing that was a problem in the book was, at the time, biologists believed in blending inheritance. Blending inheritance we now know is incorrect, but at the time, that was all the genetics we had, and blending inheritance would prevent Darwin's theory from working. Unfortunately, in 1866, shortly after Darwin had published his book in 1859, another gentleman named Gregor Mendel published a paper on genetics, but unfortunately, Darwin didn't carefully read Mendel's paper. He actually had Mendel's work in a published journal, and there are notes around that page in the journal, but it doesn't appear Darwin actually had read very carefully Mendel's paper, and as a result, he did not learn that genetics actually does completely support his theory. Anyway, within a decade of 1859, most biologists actually believed in Darwin's view of the origin of life on Earth. So natural selection theory sort of took biology by storm. Let's see if I can scroll this now. Okay, so let's scroll this up and down, shall we? And the next lecture is going to go into Darwin's theory of natural selection, so I will stop with this one.